In this series, me and my team will journey across Scotland to bring you the very best breweries and distilleries, and we will showcase what they have to offer. Along the way, we'll stop by unique and amazing places for a bevy, and you never know, you might just learn something. Welcome to Bevy Trails. Just a short drive from Ballindalloch, we arrive at the iconic Cragganmore Distillery, a gem of Speyside whisky known for its complex, rich and smoky character. Cragganmore is a must-visit for whisky lovers looking to experience the craftsmanship and tradition behind one of Scotland's finest single malts. Let's step inside, let's explore the storied history and uncover what makes this distillery truly special. Welcome to the next stop on Bevy Trails. Welcome to Cragganmore, one of the best Speyside whiskies there is. Now let's go in and get a tour.
Hiya, my name's Aidan. I'll be taking you on the tour of Cragganmore today. I've been working in whisky for about 3 years, and the Cragganmore Distillery itself is actually quite a good one to come and visit. So it was built in 1869 by a man called John Smith. There's a few reasons that he'd done this. So the first reason was the fact that he'd managed distilleries such as Macallan, Glenfiddich and Glenfarclas. Glenlivet. And he was actually meant to become a co-owner of Glenfarclas, although there was an issue with the leasing on the land. This in turn meant that if he wanted to own a distillery, he would have to come over and start his own. So he came over here and he tried the Cragganmore stream and decided that it was absolutely perfect for making whisky. So he set up his distillery here, and it worked really well as well because it's right next to the Speyside Way. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Speyside Way, it's essentially a heritage walk that goes from Elgin down to Grantham, but back in the 1800s it was essentially a train line and it ran the exact same way, and it just meant you could get your local produce in and your new make spirit out to reach markets a bit further away. But to make any alcohol, you need to turn sugar and you need to ferment that. So to get sugary water, you need to get the starches and you need to turn that starch into sugar, and to reach those starches, you need to break through a protein shell. So this first stage is where we're storing our malt. So these are our malt bins, and what's in here is barley that's been malted. So malting is where we're going to weaken a protein shell. We don't break it, but we just weaken it. And the way we do this is by soaking and then drying it 3 times over a period of 2 days, and then we leave it for a further 5 days in what's called a kiln. So a kiln, it's just a big warehouse. We spread the barley on the floor and allow it to dry. Are you familiar with Talisker, Lagavulin, or any of those peated whiskies? So they get their smoky flavour from this point. So they put peat underneath it, and peat is a turf, and when you burn it, it lets off quite a lot of smoke. So that smoke will rise up through the kiln, get caught by the barley, and give you a very, very smoky flavour. Are you familiar with the pyramid hats that a lot of distilleries have? So they're quite often called pagodas. You'll see them on the Speyside Way, on the signs, the brown tourist signs. They've got that little pyramid hat on them whenever there's a distillery, and those are called pagodas. So essentially a pagoda is that pyramid hat, and it's a ventilation system. So a really, really steep pagoda means when you burn the peat underneath, it rises up and the smoke gets caught in that pagoda, meaning the barley below it's going to be very smoky. Whereas if you get a shallow pagoda, it means it lets a lot of the smoke out, meaning the barley below it isn't very smoky. Alright? So in here, we've got 6 malt bins, although for the most part we only use 5 of them. So the ones with the silver shoots coming out the bottom are our day-to-day use ones. Now, these have a combined capacity of 180 tonnes, although during a normal week of production, we're only going to be going through about 112 tonnes. This is through 16 different cycles in our mash house, but I'll tell you about that when we get there. The malt bin up at the very end is malt bin number 6, the one with the black shoot coming out the bottom. Now, we don't use this for one main reason, and that is because it's slightly smaller than the rest of our malt bins. So each one of these malt bins holds 1 arctic of malt, which is the equivalent to 1 load through in the mash house. So if we're using the one that's slightly smaller, we're mixing and matching different loads, and that just means that later on, if something goes wrong, it's a lot harder to work out which load of malt it went wrong from. So it's a bit of a problem-solving reason. So this mill here If you've been to any other distillery before, you will have seen it. It's called a Porteous mill. A little fact about this company was that they're so good at making mills, when they first started, everyone bought one. The issue with the business model was they never broke down, so nobody bought a second one. This in turn meant that the company went bankrupt. So that just means that it's very, very good at what it does. And what it does for us is it ensures consistency. So it takes the malt from up the top and it crushes it down into 2 sets of rollers, and they'll crush the malt up into 3 different things. So we've got 20% of it is going to be made up of husk, which is kind of the shell of the barley. That's going to act as a lubricant and a filter later on. 70% of it is going to be made up of grit. That's essentially a halfway point between barley and flour, and the final 10% is going to be made up of flour. This 20-70-10 ratio is very, very common with a lot of distilleries because it's all the pipes can handle essentially. If we use too much flour, it means the pipes clog up too much and it cuts down in production. And especially coming out of the mash tun, that husk acts as a filter at the bottom, meaning it prevents any of the solids getting through, and it's just a liquid going through the pipes, which is once again ideal for a smooth running distillery. Now, that combination will come down to the bottom here, and it's going to be called grist at this point. That grist will then fly along to this grain elevator here, rise up and go through to the next room. The grain elevator rises up and it connects to our draft hopper, or grist hopper, sorry, which will funnel it along and put it into our mash tun. So if you want to have a look, this is one of those surfaces that can be quite hot, so if we're just aware of that, you're more than welcome to have a look inside. Now it is empty right now, but when it's full, it either looks like really, really runny porridge or it looks like dried out mud. Now, what this is doing is this is a 7-hour long process where we're going to take those natural starches and turn it into sugar. So it's at this point we're going to make sugary water. And the way we do this is essentially by cooking it. So we take liquid from heating tank number 1, which is going to be at about 64 degrees Celsius. And essentially what that does is it takes the protein shells and it breaks them off, and it means we can access the starch, and then we heat it up and turn it into sugar. Some of the protein shells are a little bit tougher and have got a bit of a tighter grip on that starch, so to break through that, we use an increase in temperature. So we use heating tank number 2, which is going to be our Cragganmore stream liquid. That's going to be at about 84 degrees Celsius, so 20 degrees warmer than the aforementioned heating tank number 1. And that's just to break through those tougher shells. So after the 7 hours is done, we have 3 different things: wort, sparge, and draff. So draff, that's a porridge that we're kind of left over with. We're going to send that either to a bioplant to be turned into fuel for our trucks, or it's going to be sent to a farm where it can be used as feed for cattle. The sparge is the kind of liquid residue that we're left over with. That'll be put into heating tank number 1, and that's going to be used as the first fill of water in our next cycle. So one thing about the Scotch is that we're very, very frugal, and I think it's especially true in the way that we make our whiskey. So pretty much all of our byproducts go into something else. Now, as for the product that we're taking out of this, it's going to be our wort. So that's our sugary water. Our sugary water will go through fermentation, at which point we can turn it into alcohol. We take 28,000 litres of wort, which is 1 cycle in our mash tun, cycle it through into one of these washbacks. Now, these washbacks are 20 foot tall, and when they're filled up, they'll fill up to about where my foot is, as you can kind of see in there. So what we've done is we've added yeast to it. So we've added about 160 litres of yeast, although this is subject to change. Essentially, fermentation. So you can tell it's an active fermentation because it's bubbling at the top right now. There's 3 stages to fermentation. Does anyone know anything about fermentation? No? Ideal. That does make my job quite easy. So there's 3 stages to fermentation, but the second and third stage is just first and second fermentation. So I'll be speaking about them as one. So the first main stage is called a lag phase. So this is where the yeast has just been added to its wort, and that's just going to be it getting acquainted with its environment and used to its new surroundings. For us, this lasts about 12 hours. After these 12 hours, we're going to actually start to move into our second and third phases, which is fermentation. So the longer fermentation goes on, the different esters that you have, and the different esters you get, the different flavour profiles you get. So about 40 hours, you get more of a nutty and a cereal flavour. The likes of Cardew, our sister distillery, they go up to about 75 hours, where they get more of a grassy and a floral flavour. Here at Cragganmore, we either have a short or a long fermentation of either 50 hours or 60 hours, and that will give us a honey flavour from it. Now, we have these closed so that we can starve the yeast of oxygen. So if we've got oxygen being exposed into there, the yeast will reproduce, and that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the yeast to die, because the dead yeast is our alcohol. It doesn't sound very pleasant, but this is one of those times you're going to need to trust the process. When yeast dies, it also lets off quite a lot of CO2. So this is one of the things we need to be concerned about. So if we come in here and the washback lids are open, you might find you can smell CO2, and that's all due to the chemical reaction. We've got the exhaust vents where we vent them out into the atmosphere, because our natural surroundings, on an industrial scale, we're not producing that much, and the environment can kind of deal with what we're putting out. If we were like a brewer, we would then think about looking at sending it to a bioplant where we can treat it properly, because at that point it would be financially viable. Our washbacks are made out of pine wood. The main reason for this is because pine trees are very, very tall and very, very soft, so they're easy to work with, and we can make an entire tree or an entire strut out of one tree rather than having to piece together lots of smaller ones. What we've got in here is two sets of two stills. So we've got wash still, spirit still, another wash still, and another spirit still. What we do is we take the wash from the previous part in that process, that 9% bad tasting beer, and we put it into our wash still. And essentially what these are is our massive kettles. So we heat them up, the vapours then rise through our swan neck, down our lye pipe, and then through our worm tub condensers. So those condensers that I pointed out earlier on, it then comes out of there as what's called a low wine. So that low wine is on average 23% ABV, although once again, this can vary quite a bit. That low wine then goes into our spirit still, at which point heat it up, it goes through our lye pipe once more, comes out of the worm tub condenser as three different things: our head, our heart, and our tail. So the head of the whiskey is about 78% ABV. Similar to absinthe. So has anyone ever heard that old expression, that man's blind drunk, or he's drank himself blind? Yeah? So that comes from back in the 1800s, when distillers used to drink the whole whiskey instead of just the heart of the whiskey, and they'd give themselves alcohol poisoning essentially, and that would result in them going blind. So we don't really want to be selling this to customers, so we'll cut off the head of the whiskey, and I'll tell you how we do that when we get down to the spirit safe. As for the heart of the whiskey, that's the good stuff, the liquid gold. That's the stuff that's going to wind up on supermarket shelves. That's going to be about 61% to 76% ABV. So right in the sweet spot. And pretty much anything below this, but averaging around about 30%, that's going to be what's called our tail. So our tail, not strong enough to turn into alcohol. All right? Now, as for the main byproduct that we get, out of our wash still, we've got what's called pot ale. So has anyone ever heard of the old marriage tradition, tallering and feathering? Yeah? We have a very similar tradition up here called a blackening, where instead of using tar, we'll replace it with pot ale, and that's my personal favourite use. Now, the other things we can use pot ale for, it's very similar to the draft. We can send it to a farm or a bioplant to be used as food for animals or fuel for things like trucks. All right? Now, our still shape also plays quite a big influence on the flavour. So, something to note is our wash, we shoot it through our wash still very, very quickly. So it comes out of there very, very oily. So we've got a very, very oily spirit coming at the bottom of our spirit stills. Now, there's two main rules when it comes to this sort of spirit, the still shape, sorry. So the taller a still is, the lighter the spirit, the shorter the still, the heavier the spirit. And on top of that, the more copper contacts the vapours have, the more they get stripped of sulphur, and the less sulphur in a whiskey, the less oily it's going to be. So more copper contact, less oil. Now these still, I'll speak through our spirit still, and it is kind of contradictory. You're just going to have to bear with me and understand that Cragganmore's a little bit of a complicated spirit. It doesn't make much sense to me, but someone up the line has decided this is how we make such a good whiskey, so you'll just have to bear with me. Now there's four main components to our spirit still. So we've got a reflux bulge, which is sometimes referred to as a copper onion. Then we've got our flat top, as opposed to our swan neck. We've got our lye pipe facing down the way, as opposed to up the way. And then coming out the back, we've got our worm tub condenser, as opposed to our regular condensers. Now, our low wines, as I said, they're very, very oily in the bottom. Now, when we heat them up, they become vapours, and these are very, very light, so that means they rise up. So we heat them up, they rise to the top. Now, instead of going straight up and through, like a swan neck, it hits the top, and it'll bounce off the top, giving it time to cool. Now, when it's colder, it becomes a little bit denser and a little bit heavier. So that'll cling onto the side of the wall, or the side of the still, sorry, and kind of dribble its way down, kind of more interaction with copper, so making it a little bit less oily. Now we'll reach this reflux bulge, at which point it's essentially just more surface area before it reaches this heat. So it'll kind of interact with copper, then it'll reach the bottom where it'll heat up again. Now it'll just continue to go up and down until eventually it makes it into our lye pipe. Now this is where it starts to get contradictory. So the way I look at it is, when it gets to this lye pipe, it's absolutely perfect. We don't want to strip any more sulphur from it, so we just want to send it straight through, because it's just the right level of oily. Now our lye pipe is facing down the way. Now if it was facing up the way, it'd be working against gravity. This means it has to work with the copper and strip it of even more sulphurs to get through there, but the fact it's facing down the way, we can shoot it quite quickly through our lye pipe. Now, as for our worm tub condenser, it's actually a smaller surface area to a regular condenser, and we can also shoot it through that very quickly. So that gives us not more oil, but it doesn't take away any more. All right, so coming out of there, we've got this bit here, stripping it of oil, and this bit here, no more oil is being stripped. So what we've got in here is our spirit safe. Now, as Scotch people, we tend to lie to the government quite a bit, so we don't have to pay as many taxes. Distillers in specific really hate paying their taxes. So the government coined onto this, and they made us install spirit safes. So essentially what this was, behind a lock, we've got measurement devices so that the government can accurately tell how much alcohol we're producing, and that way they can tax us fairly. Nowadays we're thought to be a little bit more trustworthy, so our still operators have got the keys to them, although it is still watched by a camera and they have to sign the keys out. And it's essentially they can open it up just so they can clean it. Tend not to happen very often, or especially not when visitors are in, because there is alcohol behind the safe still. Now, to answer your question from earlier on, sir, you were asking us how do we split them up and kind of what happens there. Now, if you think about it, coming through here, we'd have our low wines. So this flows through very much like a waterfall, and it will get collected in this tank down here. We then have all these dials in the centre, which are going to help us work out our density and our temperature, so we can work out our alcoholic content. And the alcoholic content is how we differentiate the head, the heart, and the tail. So this is where this side comes in. So we've got a tap here, I'll speak about this one, which is spirit still number 1. So that's still up there, the one that I was talking through. Now, as soon as we start turning that on, kind of a few minutes in, we're going to start to see our head coming out. So our head, very, very clear liquid, and it'll flow through there just like a waterfall. Now after about 15 to 20 minutes, they'll have these all filled up, so they turn these and that fills them up with liquid, and they'll be reading these and keeping a keen eye on them. When they start to notice the alcoholic content dropping to the point in which it's the head coming through, they'll then take this handle and they'll move it over. Now this is called cutting your spirit. So it's at this point, the heart is going into the centre jug here. Now towards the end, we're going to start to see it's not strong enough to be classed as the heart anymore. And they'll just continue to read this dial, and at that point, they'll just move the handle straight back over, and the tail will be collected into this jug on the left-hand side here. So for the first 15 minutes, the head comes out, sorry. After that, the heart comes out, and then after that, the tail comes out. Now, the head and the tail, as I said, Scotch people, very, very frugal. We don't like to waste anything. So what we do is we mix the head with the tail, we mix them together, along with our low wines, and then we just put it straight through spirit still number 2. So that's essentially just so that we're not wasting anything, because the head and the tail, they kind of average out to reach something that we could class as a low wine almost, and just shove it straight back into our second distillation. And that's pretty much how this works. Got in here is our warehouse. First thing you'll notice is that lovely smell. On a really, really warm day outside, a bit unlike today, you come in here, it'll still be nice and cold in here. This is done very deliberately. So we've got our dirt floors and our thick concrete walls to keep the temperature in here nice and low. The reason for this is to prevent evaporation. Despite our best efforts, we still lose about 2% every single year. Now that 2%, you'll quite often hear it referred to as the angel share. So essentially, as Scots, we're delusional, and we like to pretend it's the angels coming down, having a drink out of our casks, and making sure that everything's turning out okay. Now this is of course not the case. It is just 2% is lost to evaporation. And you're probably thinking, Aidan, 2% a year, that's not that big a deal. So if we take this cask here from 1964, so the oldest cask in our warehouse, 60 years old, it's probably been filled up to about just under a quarter full is all that's left in it, and that's purely due to evaporation. So the vast majority of it has been lost all to angel share. So it does start to add up when we're maturing whiskies for 50, 60, 70 years sometimes. Now, sir, you were asking me earlier on about the slight differences in the batches. I'll explain that now. So there will be slight differences in the batches because there's small variables that we just can't control, like the kind of barley that comes in. And we might find that we try from this barrel, for example, which is meant to be Cragganmore 12-year-old, and it's a little bit too nutty. We'll then try from the barrel on the right, and it's not nutty enough. What we do is we marry them casks together, which is essentially just mixing them together, and that'll give us that average flavour that we're looking for. Of course, this is done with loads of different tasting notes by someone that's a lot smarter than me. Now, It's still going to be classed as a single malt whiskey, because if you break down single malt, single from a single distillery and malt made out of malt. It'd be classed as a blend if we were to, for example, take, let's pretend that Cragganmore and Cardew had an identical production system. Even if we mixed them together and the whiskies tasted, smelled and looked identical, at that point it'd be a blend, because it's more than one distillery. You can also find grain whiskies start to come in that way as well to a blend, but you can also get grain whiskies by themselves. They tend to be a little bit more uncommon though. Yeah, so the cask it's put in is probably the biggest factor on the flavour. So 70% of the flavour comes from the cask. All of the colour also comes from the cask. The other 30% comes from the production side that we've just looked over. So the heart of the whiskey, that 61% to 76%, goes into one of these casks, and it'll give it different flavours depending on which cask it's in. So if we take this one here, for example, this is what you would refer to as a charred oak cask, or a rejuvenated cask. And essentially what this is it's a cask that's been around and it's used its full lifespan, which is about 40 years for a cask. And then what we've done, because we're not getting those pungent flavours out of it anymore, we burn the inside of it, and then it kind of gives it a new life, giving us lightly smoked whiskey. So it's not a peated whiskey, because peating is something you do in the process, but it would still be lightly smoky because of the barrel that it's in. And when you put the whiskey in, it'll absorb that burnt flavour. Now, this is quite often used as a finishing cask. So what a finishing cask is, it's essentially, you put, let's say, Cragganmore into a bourbon barrel for 15 years. We then take it out of that bourbon barrel, and then we'll put it into a charred oak cask for less than a year to up to 3 years. Now, what that'll do is it'll give you the finish on the whiskey. So you're drinking it, and the last thing left in your mouth, that's going to be light smoke, and that'll be coming from this barrel here. You can also see our distiller's edition. That's done in a port cask. And have you heard of Glenfiddich's 21-year-old? Yes, that's got a little bit of a story behind it. So the 21-year-old, it's made out of rum cask. It's finished off in a rum cask. And are you familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Yes? That did actually have a small impact on the whiskey industry. So essentially America, who's our biggest consumer, put a lot of economic sanctions onto Cuba, and they said, if you're still buying casks from Cuba, you can't sell whiskey over here. Now you obviously don't want to be losing them as a client, so instead of losing them as a client, they said, we'll stop buying casks from Cuba, but this left them with the problem of where do we get our casks from? So they started making their own rum. Now what they done was they took rum that they made, they put it into a cask, they took it out, and then they threw it away. So you're probably thinking, this doesn't really make much business sense. So nowadays they have decided that they're going to start selling it. But if you ever see discarded rum on the shelves, that's the rum that you use to make the 21-year-old finishing casks. And it's called discarded rum because they used to throw it away. Yeah, so you can quite often hear port casks talked about. Charred oak casks, rum casks definitely crop up a lot. You can see champagne casks, Canadian ice wine, red wine casks, bodega casks. But the two that are by far the most common is going to be your sherry butt and your bourbon hogshead. So it's called a butt and a hogshead because a butt is 500 litres in size and a hogshead is 250 litres in size. So that's essentially just the size of the barrel. Now a bourbon barrel, they're quite cheap to buy. They're about £200 for us. There's a few reasons for this. Reason number one, the bourbon industry right now is booming. So there's a high production on bourbon casks, or bourbon whiskey, sorry. So that means a lot of casks are going in. Now on top of this, they can't reuse their casks. So over here, we can reuse them 4 times, but past second or third, it'll start to lose a lot of its flavour. So we tend not to go past that. But obviously in America they can't. So that means every cask that goes in has to come out. So a lot going in and a lot coming out. So quite high supply, low demand, so quite a low price. As for our sherry casks, it's the exact opposite story. So not very many folk drink sherry. I've been working in whiskey for a few years now, and the first person I ever had that drank whiskey on my tour, I said, nobody drinks sherry anymore, and she turned around and went, actually, I do, and that was 3 weeks ago. So very few people drink sherry anymore. So that means the production has gone straight downhill. On top of that, they can reuse their sherry casks. So that means few casks going in and even fewer casks are coming out. So very, very low supply, but a very high demand. So basic economics dictates quite a high price. So these come for about £2,000. Now, out of your bourbon barrel, you get your lighter flavours, your vanillas, your honeys, your caramels, the kind of things you would associate with American bourbon, surprising enough. Out of your sherry cask, you get your heavier flavours. Your winter flavours, they're quite often grouped as orchard fruits, so your plums, your pears and grapes kind of come out of your sherry cask. Has anyone heard the term of a Scottish hug before? No? So a Scotch hug, when you're drinking a wintry whiskey, You drink it and you feel all warm inside, just like someone's giving you a hug. Now, I can testify that this does work. So through most of the year, I'm at university and I can't afford to pay my heating bills. So instead of paying my heating bills, I go out and I buy a bottle of whiskey. That definitely keeps me warm and happy. Although that being said, my grades don't look the best. So there is a trade-off. Now, you're more than welcome to kind of come up and have a smell between the two casks for yourself, because our noses will work differently. So don't worry, I don't bite. Come and have a smell. If you've got a really keen sense of smell, you might be able to work out 40 to 50 tasting notes. But if you're like me and kind of an average, you might be able to work out 5 or 6. So there is quite a big difference. So out of this dram here, and it's straight from that sherry cask that you just saw us draw from, that is going to be your deeper, more orchard fruits. You're probably going to get your grapes coming out there, maybe a little bit of plum, a little bit of pear, and it'll be sort of reminiscent of the kind of flavours that you get out of wine, because sherry, after all, is just a fortified wine. But as for the whiskey, it's the last little part. So a lot of you probably have a lot more experience tasting whiskey than me. So I'm going to talk briefly through about how to taste whiskey, because it's not very nice to have somebody this, and this. So a lot of people say there is a right and a wrong way to drink whiskey. This is not true at all. At the end of the day, if you want to drink it with Coke in it, drink it with Coke in it. If you want to drink it with Iron Brew in it, I'll look at you funny, but you can drink it with Iron Brew in it. I myself, I like to drink it with ice in it. And what the ice does is that'll freeze up the flavour molecules. And essentially, I find it makes the whiskey taste all as one, rather than being able to work out those individual tasting notes. And I just prefer it that way. But if I am drinking to try and work out tasting notes and make a fair comparison between a lot of different single malts, the way I'd go about doing that is I would smell the whiskey 3 times with nothing in it, have a little taste once or twice, and then add a few drops of water to it. And even that is enough to kind of open it up and change the spirit, make it a lot smoother. And that's kind of one of the better ways to go about doing it. But as I say, it is your dram at the end of the day, so drink it how you like. Now, the 3 whiskies that you've got in front of you, working from left to right, the one on the far left, that's going to be your Cragganmore Distillery exclusive. So that's a red wine finished cask. Now, off the nose, I get a little bit of pear, but then as I start to drink it, I really get chocolate popping out. It is a little bit odd, that's just me, but you might agree with me or you might disagree with me, and that's completely fair. As for the cask, or as for the whiskey in the centre, that's going to be your bourbon. So that 1999 bourbon, the 25-year-old. This one here, off the nose, you're going to get vanilla, and as you taste it, you're probably going to taste a lot of honey coming through due to our fermentation time and the cask it was matured in. As for the one on the far right, the final cask that you've got is going to be your... Don't feel the need to try and keep up with me, by the way. I'm briefly just talking over them. Don't worry, if you're struggling to keep up with me, that's fine. As for the 15-year-old, this is the one on the far right, and it's my personal favourite. It's double matured, so that means it's matured in bourbon, taken out and put into another bourbon cask. Off the nose, I get hints of vanilla, but then as I drink it down, butterscotch really starts to pop through. We had somebody on my tour the other day come in and say, that tastes a lot like a Liquid Werther's Original, and I think, to be honest with you, it's completely fair. It's very sweet, very, very smooth, very enjoyable. It is a little bit stronger than the others though, at 48%, so that is just something to note.
Before you wrap up your visit, don't forget to stop by the Cragganmore gift shop. It's packed with a fantastic selection of unique treasures and souvenirs, perfect for any whiskey enthusiast or to treat yourself to something special. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Bevy Trails. If you've enjoyed this journey, be sure to hit that like button and give us a follow to stay updated with all our adventures. Cheers, and we'll see you next time.